Bram knew the mountain better than he knew people, and on a morning when the mist clung to the cliffs like a held breath, he heard the scraping of failing fingers on stone. An orc woman dangled over the drop, her assassin's blade still strapped to her back, her green knuckles white with strain. He pulled her up without thinking, then spent the next hour wondering if she'd kill him for the favor. By dawn, fever set in, and when he peeled back her vest to treat a wound, a folded parchment slipped from an inner pocket. The seal was royal, the handwriting unmistakable, and the message was a death warrant with her own name on it. She'd been sent to eliminate a rebel lord, but the note named her as the next target, double-crossed by the same king who'd hired her. When her eyes opened, he held up the note, and for the first time he saw something behind the warrior's mask that looked less like rage and more like the same loneliness he carried. They held the proof that could shatter a throne, and neither of them would ever be safe again. Bram had lived alone in the Thornridge Mountains since the fever took his family a decade ago, a man more comfortable with pine and raven than politics. The woman he pulled from the cliff was no ordinary hired blade, she was Vesa, a Shadowed Fang assassin whose kills had reshaped the balance of power across 3 kingdoms. But the note in her pocket revealed a truth that rewrote everything. King Aldrin of Sundergard, the same monarch who commissioned her, had ordered her execution the moment the target fell. Now 2 outcasts held proof of a royal conspiracy. If they could survive long enough to deliver it, they would topple a tyrant. If they failed, the king's hunters would ensure no one ever found their bodies. The chase began the night the fever broke. The chase began the night the fever broke. Vesa opened her eyes to the dim glow of a single candle and the face of a man she had never met, sitting in a rickety chair with one hand resting on the hilt of a wood axe. Her assassin's instinct screamed to reach for a blade, but her blades were gone, hung on a peg across the room next to a worn leather satchel she did not recognize. Her ribs screamed louder, wrapped tight in torn linen. The room smelled of pine resin and old smoke. A forester's cabin. She tried to speak and managed only a rasp. Bram lifted a tin cup of water to her lips without a word. No demand for thanks, no fear of the orc woman who had killed more nobles than most plague seasons. Just water and patience and a folded piece of parchment he set on the blanket beside her hand. The parchment. The royal seal. It all came back to her in fragments, the climb up the cliff face after the botched extraction, the loose rock that gave way, the endless seconds dangling above a ravine that would have swallowed her bones without ceremony. And before that, the mission itself. King Aldrin of Sundergard had summoned her personally, an unprecedented move for a monarch who normally communicated through layers of intermediaries. He wanted Lord Tavian Margrave eliminated. Tavian controlled the northern passes and had been funneling grain and arms to border villages that Aldrin had ordered starved as punishment for refusing the crown's new taxation edicts. The king framed it as an act of rebellion. To Vesa it was simply a contract, paid in gold and sealed with the promise of safe passage out of Sundergard once the deed was done. She had completed the contract in 3 days. Lord Tavian fell in his own courtyard, and by the time the household guards realized what had happened, she was already 2 miles beyond the estate walls, vanishing into the foothills. But the note in her pocket told a different story. Not an official communique, a private missive drafted in the king's own hand, using the same cipher the Shadowed Fang had provided to the crown for top-secret correspondence. The message was addressed to Aldrin's spymaster, and it contained a list. 3 names. The first was Lord Tavian Margrave, marked with a flourish that signified the task was underway. The second was Vesa of the Shadowed Fang, marked with a different symbol, a single triangle inside a circle, the assassin's code for terminate upon completion. She had seen that symbol before. She had executed those orders before. The third name made her breath stop. A merchant woman she had never heard of, Lyra Corswell, who ran a way station in the eastern foothills and whose only apparent crime was providing shelter to a fugitive noble 3 summers ago. Marked with the same termination symbol, Aldrin was clearing house, not just eliminating a rival lord, but systematically erasing every independent actor who might someday threaten his consolidation of absolute power. Vesa was never meant to leave Sundergaard alive. She was a loose end to be burned, wiped from the record so thoroughly that even the Shadowed Fang would not look for her. If you think that kind of operational brutality is rare, consider this. The Shadowed Fang had been the Crown's hidden blade for 20 years, a guild of precision killers who answered to no king but accepted contracts through a neutral intermediary. Aldrin had used them to remove political obstacles, rivals, even members of his own council who had grown too powerful. But Aldrin's ambition had outgrown the guild's neutrality. He no longer wanted a hired blade, he wanted a monopoly on violence. And the first step was eliminating the very assassins who had built his throne. Vesa had been marked the moment she accepted the contract, because the moment she completed it, she became evidence. The spy master had already dispatched a tracking team to the foothills, assuming she would follow the extraction route she had signaled. The only reason she was not dead already was that the cliff had claimed her before the hunters could. Bram watched her read the note, her green face hardening with a fury that seemed too large for the small room. He had found the parchment while she was unconscious, and though he could not read the cipher, the royal seal alone told him enough. He knew the king's mark. Everyone in the Thornridge Mountains knew it, because the tax collectors carried it while they stripped the highland villages of grain that should have fed children through the winter. He had seen that seal on the eviction notice that took his family's farm. Now it was on a note in the pocket of a dying orc woman, and the coincidence was too sharp to ignore. He didn't ask if she planned to take revenge. He asked, "How many days before they find us?" Vesa assessed the situation with the cold, rapid calculation of a woman who had spent her life operating inside hostile territory. The forest outside was dense, the game trails known only to Bram. The nearest garrison loyal to Aldrin was a 2-day ride south. But the hunting team would not wait for reinforcements. They would be moving now, tracking the signal she had left before the cliff. A small, carved stone she had planted near the cliff base as a marker for her extraction, which the king's men would be using as a beacon. She had maybe 2 days before they narrowed the search grid. Less if they had already picked up her trail. Then Bram said something that changed the calculation entirely. The note mentions a way station. If this Lyra Corswell is still alive, she might know something. She's 3 days east, through the Thornwood Gorge. Vesa looked at the forester, this solitary man who had no reason to trust her and every reason to leave her to die. And she saw the same thing he had seen in her eyes that first morning. A recognition of shared threat. Aldrin had taken from him too. And now they both held the proof that could expose the king's entire scheme. Proof that Lyra Corswell, the last name on the list, might help them deliver if she hadn't already been silenced. The first turning point arrived not with a knock on the door, but with the sound of a signal whistle echoing across the ridge at dusk, a pattern Vesa recognized from the Shadowed Fang's own training protocols. The hunters had found her marker. They were triangulating, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin, a pulse of torchlight flickered and died. The deliberate signal of a scout reporting a confirmed target location. The chase had officially begun. If they were going to survive the night, they would have to leave the cabin, and everything in it, behind. But before they could move, another sound cut through the silence, closer and far more dangerous. the creak of a floorboard on the not the hunter outside. Someone was already inside. The creak was not from the hunter outside. It came from the corner of the cabin, where the shadows pooled thickest beside the cold hearth. Bram's hand tightened on the axe haft as Vessa's predator eyes locked onto the darkness, and for one heartbeat, the only sound was the distant whistle of wind through the pine. Then the shape moved. A figure in dark leathers, smaller than the scout outside, stepping forward with a blade already drawn. A woman, human, her face obscured by a half-mask and hood, her stance marking her as someone trained in the same silent arts as Vessa. "The fox lies in the trap," she said, low and cold, and the words were not directed at Bram. They were the ident phrase the shadowed Fang used to confirm a kill order. She had come for Vessa. Vessa's body screamed against movement, but she rolled off the bed, pulling the blanket with her, tangling the assassin's first strike in wool and linen. The blade sliced through fabric instead of flesh. Bram swung the axe in a tight arc, not to kill, he was no fighter, but the sudden aggression forced the woman back a step, giving Vessa precious seconds to snatch one of her own blades from the peg. She took it left-handed, her right wrist still useless, but her left was more than sufficient. The cabin erupted in the sharp clang of steel meeting steel. Outside, the signal whistle fell silent. The hunters had heard the commotion. The fight lasted less than a minute. Vessa drove the assassin against the wall, blade tip pressed to the hollow of her throat, while Bram barred the door with the overturned table. The woman's eyes were defiant, unafraid, the mark of a Fang operative who had long ago accepted death as the price of service. But Vessa didn't strike. Instead, she reached up with her injured hand, the one she couldn't clench, and pushed back the assassin's hood. "You're not Fang," Vessa said. "You're wearing the mask, but your footwork is Crown military. The Fang trains in the southpaw stance. You lead with your right." The woman's face flashed something, surprise, then anger. She was a royal agent, not a guild assassin, sent to finish the job before the real hunters could claim the glory. King Aldrin had deployed his own operatives alongside the Fang's trackers, a duplication of effort that spoke to his paranoia. He didn't trust anyone. Bram cracked open the door a sliver. The torchlight outside was closer now, two distinct pulses moving through the tree line. The hunters were no longer triangulating, they were converging. They had heard the floorboard too, or the clash of blades, and they were coming fast. The captured agent took advantage of Vessa's distraction, twisting free and lunging for the door. Bram intercepted her with the flat of the axe handle, dropping her unconscious to the floor. But the damage was done. The doorframe cracked under the impact, and the sound carried through the forest like a beacon. The hunters broke into a run. Vessa and Bram fled through the rear window, pushing past the mud-chinked logs and out into the cold night. The forest swallowed them, the ancient pines closing ranks as if the mountain itself wanted to hide them. They moved fast and silent, Vessa navigating by starlight and the instincts of a predator who had survived 100 pursuits. Bram guided them onto a hidden game trail that switched back down the gorge, a path so narrow and steep that horses couldn't follow. For an hour they pushed through darkness, the shouts of the hunters fading behind them, until the only sound was their own ragged breathing and the distant rush of the Thornwater River below. When they finally stopped to rest, Vessa leaned against a granite boulder and pulled the creased parchment from her belt. She had grabbed it from the cabin before they fled. The note. The death warrant. She needed to understand the third name. Lyra Corswell, way station keeper. It didn't make sense. Why would a king who obsessed over eliminating political threats waste resources on a merchant woman? Vessa turned the parchment over. In the flicker of Bram's small fire starter, a detail she had missed before, the wax seal, the king's rampant stag impression, had been stamped over a secondary design. Fine lines in the wax that formed the Shadowed Fang's hidden mark, the mark the guild used to pass secret messages among its highest ranks. She scraped away the top layer of wax with her thumb, and beneath it, a second cipher emerged, different from the one used by the crown. It was a pattern of dots and dashes, a code she had learned 15 years ago when she first entered the Fang's inner circle. The message read, "Corswell holds the Stone Charter. Retrieve or destroy. The throne depends on it." The Stone Charter. The name hit Vesa like a physical blow. She had heard whispers of it in the guild halls, rumors dismissed as legend. It was supposed to be the founding document of Sundergaard, signed in blood by the first King Aldrin's grandfather, a treaty that bound the realm's noble houses to the crown. But the legend also said the charter contained a hidden clause, a provision that could invalidate the current king's claim if a true-born heir of the dispossessed line ever came forward. Most people thought it was a fairy tale. But if Lyra Corswell possessed it, and if Aldrin was desperate to destroy it, then the fairy tale was real, and the king was not the rightful ruler of Sundergaard. This was the pivot. The assassination of Lord Tavian, the hunt for Vesa, the entire network of eliminations. It was not just about consolidating power. It was about erasing every living soul who could connect the dots back to the charter. The king was not defending his reign. He was burying the proof that his reign was a lie. And the Shadowed Fang, the guild that had served the crown for 2 decades, had been infiltrated by the king's agents, its internal codes used to lure its own members into traps. Vesa had been sent to kill Lord Tavian, not because she was expendable, but because Tavian's house had once sheltered the charter. By the time she realized what she was truly being asked to do, it would have been too late. Bram listened to her explanation with the grim silence of a man who had already lost everything to this king and was now being told the entire kingdom was built on a fraud. "If this charter exists," he said, "and we can get it into the hands of the rebel lords, Aldrin's own armies will turn on him. The nobles will have a legal reason to revolt." Vesa nodded. That was the lever they needed. Not just proof of murder, but proof of illegitimacy. And the only person who could lead them to it was a woman whose way station was now 3 days east through hostile territory, with the king's hunters and a rogue Fang agent still on their trail. They moved at first light, keeping to the high ridges where the pines grew thick and the underbrush hid their tracks. By midday, they caught their first real break, a trapper's line cabin abandoned for the season, where they found a rusted iron bow and a half-stocked larder. Bram strung the bow with cord from his pack. Vesa took inventory of their supplies. She had her blades, but only one hand to wield them. Bram had his axe and some skill with a bow. Hunting skill, not combat skill. They were outnumbered, out-trained, and running on a deadline they couldn't see. But they had something the hunters didn't. A destination. The second night brought the first real test of their fragile alliance. Vesa's fever returned, a simmering heat that left her shivering even beside the fire. Bram brewed willow bark tea and waited, watching the woman who had killed lords and now could barely hold a cup without spilling. In the flickering light, she looked less like a monster and more like a casualty, a weapon discarded by the same hand that had wielded her. He asked, before he could stop himself, "Why did you become an assassin?" She stared into the flames for a long moment. "Because the king's soldiers burned my village when I was 8. The Fang found me in the ashes and gave me a purpose. I thought I was taking revenge. Turns out I was just making his enemies fewer." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, just heavy. the weight of two people who had been broken by the same machine and were only now realizing they were on the same side. By the third day, they reached the foothills where the way station was supposed to be. The trail widened into a wagon road, and they saw smoke rising from a chimney ahead. But it was not the welcoming hearth of an inn, it was black, acrid, the smoke of wet wool and burning pitch. They found the way station in ruins, the main building collapsed, the stables torched, and in the courtyard, the bodies of 2 horses and 1 woman. Not Lyra Corswell. A servant, dressed in the apron of a cook, still clutching a kitchen knife. The attackers had been thorough, but Lyra was nowhere among the dead. In the cellar beneath the collapsed inn, they discovered why: a hidden chamber, sealed with a heavy iron door, and inside a trunk containing scrolls and ledgers, and a single, unbroken wax seal. The stone charter was not there, but a note, written in a hurried hand, said, "If you seek the charter, I have taken it to the Temple of the Three Sisters. Find me there before the moon is full, or I will be dead, and the truth will die with me." Lyra. Underneath the note, a crude map to a temple high in the peaks, a place so remote that even Bram had only heard legends of it. The creak of a saddle outside. The clink of bridle chains. The hunters had not lost them after all. A voice, muffled but clear, shouted orders to surround the cellar. Vesa and Bram exchanged a look. They had the location, the proof that the charter existed, and a ticking clock. But first, they had to survive the next 10 minutes. The king's men were above them, and they were underground, with only one way out. Then Bram noticed a second exit, a drainage grate in the floor leading to a culvert that emptied somewhere beyond the outer wall. They pried it open as the iron door above splintered under the ram. The last thing they heard before dropping into the darkness was the hunter captain shouting, "Burn it all. No one leaves alive." And then, the roar of flames. The drainage grate dropped them into a stone culvert slick with moss and freezing runoff. Above, the way station groaned as flames chewed through the last timbers, and the shouts of the hunters echoed down the shaft like voices from a nightmare. Bram landed badly, twisting an ankle, but Vesa hauled him upright with her one good arm, her face set in the grim determination of a woman who had crawled out of worse. The culvert emptied into a ravine 50 yards from the burning inn. They waded through knee-deep water, ducked under a fallen log, and vanished into the undergrowth just as the first hunter peered over the edge and loosed an arrow that splashed harmlessly into the stream. The hunters did not follow. Not immediately. The fire had bought Bram and Vesa a thin margin of time because the captain had orders to recover the way station's records and could not abandon the scene until the flames were suppressed. But Vesa knew that margin was measured in hours, not days. The hunters would regroup, bring dogs, and follow the scent of wet wool and blood. If they were going to reach the Temple of the Three Sisters before the full moon, they would have to move faster than they had ever moved, through terrain that wanted to kill them, with a woman whose fever kept threatening to return and a forester whose ankle was already swelling. They climbed. The map Lyra had left was crude but accurate, marking a trail that climbed from the foothills into the high peaks, a path that had not been maintained in decades. The forest thickened, the pines giving way to gnarled, wind-bent junipers, and the air grew thin and cold. At night they huddled together under a single blanket, Vesa's body radiating heat that had nothing to do with warmth, her wound angry and red. Bram stripped the splint and rebound it with fresh moss, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man who had spent 10 years alone. Vesa watched him work, and in the silence that followed, she asked a question that had been gnawing at her since the cabin. "Why did you help me? You didn't know about the charter. You had no reason." Bram tied off the bandage and looked at her. "Because I heard you on that cliff before I saw you. You were fighting. Not screaming, not begging, fighting, and the world had taken enough from me. I thought, maybe this one time it doesn't take. The third day of climbing brought them to the tree line and their first clear view of the temple. It was carved into the face of a granite peak, a structure of pillars and arches that had been built when the old gods were still spoken to by name. Moss covered the steps, and the only sound was the wind keening through the empty halls. But something was wrong. The outer gate hung open, its iron bars twisted outward, not inward. Someone had forced their way in recently. And in the dust of the courtyard, Vesa found fresh boot prints, military issue, the same pattern she had seen outside the way station. The hunters had not followed them to the temple. They had already been here. She drew her blade. Bram knocked an arrow. They entered the temple together, moving through halls that smelled of old incense and fresh blood. The first body they found was a hunter, throat cut, his weapon still sheathed. The second was the Fang operative from the cabin, the woman Vesa had left unconscious, now dead with a note pinned to her tunic. The note was written in the same cipher Vesa had learned from the guild. The charter is not a document, it's a person. Find her before Aldrin does. Lyra had been here, and she had killed 2 hunters before escaping. But the message made no sense. A person? The stone charter was supposed to be a treaty, a parchment with signatures and seals. If it was a person, then the entire premise of Aldrin's purge shifted. He wasn't trying to destroy a document. He was trying to kill an heir. Vesa's mind raced. The hidden clause in the original charter, the one rumored to invalidate the current king's claim, it must specify that a legitimate heir of the original bloodline could challenge the throne, and that heir had been hidden, protected by a network of loyalists who had passed the secret down through generations. Lyra Corswell was not a way station keeper, she was the guardian of the heir. The assassinations, the purges, the hunt for Vesa, Aldrin wasn't cleaning up loose ends. He was exterminating everyone who knew the heir's identity. Lord Tavian had sheltered the charter. Vesa had been contracted through channels that might have revealed the connection. Every name on that list was a link in a chain that led to a living claimant who could legally unseat the king. And now the hunters were closing in on that claimant, who was somewhere in this temple or the mountains beyond. The wait, it gets worse moment arrived as they searched the inner sanctum. Hidden behind the altar, they found a chamber with a cradle and a child's drawings on the wall. Not a baby, an older child, the drawings depicting a girl with dark hair and a familiar pattern of freckles, holding hands with a woman who looked like Lyra. The child was maybe 8 years old. And in a chest beneath the cradle, they found a journal belonging to Lyra, chronicling 15 years of hiding, moving from village to village, changing names, burying documents, and finally arriving at the temple 3 months ago, convinced that Aldrin had discovered the truth. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. The hunters are close. I've sent Alara through the high pass with Merrick. If they reach the rebel camp at Thornwall, the lords will declare for her. If they don't, the bloodline ends here. I will hold the temple as long as I can. Alara, the heir to the throne of Sundergaard, was an 8-year-old girl, running through a mountain pass with a tired guardian, while the king's best hunters closed in from behind. And Vesa and Bram now had one chance to get to her first. The high pass was a 2-day climb that crossed a glacier and a ridge known for rockfalls. It was the only route to Thornwall that avoided the main road, and if the hunters got there ahead of them, they would ambush the child before she ever reached safety. They didn't sleep. They took only water, weapons, and the journal, and they pushed into the pass as the sun set, climbing by starlight and the faint glow of the moon that was now 3 days from full, The deadline Lyra had written in her note at the way station. The air grew thin and brutal, the wind slicing across the glacier like a blade. They tied themselves together with a length of rope to avoid losing each other in the dark. Halfway up, Bram's ankle gave out completely, and he went down on the ice. Vesa pulled him up, and they kept moving, because stopping meant death for the child and for the kingdom. At dawn, they found signs of a struggle, a dropped water skin, a scrap of cloak, and in a drift of snow, a child's small boot, torn and bloodied. The hunters had caught up. But there were no bodies, not yet. The trail led up a steep couloir toward a rock shelter, and as they scrambled up, they heard a sound that stopped their hearts, a girl crying, not in fear, but in defiance. "You can't have it. I'll tear it up before you touch it." A man's voice answered, low and dangerous. "You'll do nothing, little queen. Your mother thought she could hide you forever. She was wrong." Bram and Vesa crested the ridge just as the hunter captain pulled Ilara from the shelter, one hand clamped over her mouth, the other holding a knife to her throat. Merrick lay unconscious at his feet, bleeding from a head wound. 3 other hunters flanked the captain, arrows nocked, bows aimed outward. The captain saw Vesa first and smiled. The traitor assassin and the forester. "You're just in time to watch the line of Aldrin's enemies end." But Vesa had not climbed all this way to watch. She was injured, exhausted, and outnumbered 4-2 against trained killers. But she had one advantage they didn't. She was no longer alone. Bram drew his bow, aiming not at the captain, but at the rocks above the shelter. A precarious overhang of ice and stone that had been threatening to fall for centuries. Vesa understood instantly. She lunged left, drawing the nearest hunter's arrow toward her, while Bram loosed his shot. The arrow struck the overhang's weakest point, and with a sound like the mountain splitting apart, half a ton of ice and rock cascaded down onto the hunters. The captain dove aside, releasing Ilara, who scrambled toward Merrick. 2 hunters were buried instantly. The third fled, slipping down the couloir, his nerve broken. Only the captain remained. He rose from the snow, knife still in hand, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. He looked at Vesa with pure hatred. "You think you've won? Aldrin has the rebel camp surrounded. 3,000 soldiers march on Thornwall as we speak. Even if the girl reaches them, she'll be dead before anyone declares for her. You've killed us, but you haven't stopped the war." Vesa stepped forward. Her left hand held her blade, the same blade she had used to kill Lord Tavian. The same blade that had been meant for her own execution. "I know," she said, and drove the point through the captain's chest. He fell without another word. She stood over him, breathing hard, and then turned to Ilara, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. "You're safe now," Vesa said, and it was the first time she had ever spoken those words to anyone. The girl looked at her, at Bram, at the bodies in the snow, and then she did something that broke the last wall around Vesa's heart. She ran to her and buried her face in her side. Sobbing, they reached Thornwall 3 days later. A battered procession, a forester with a ruined ankle, an orc assassin with a shattered wrist and a fever that would not break, a half-dead guardian, and a girl who carried in her blood the right to challenge a king. The rebel lords, assembled in a war council that had been debating whether to surrender or fight, fell silent as Vesa laid the journal, the forged seal, and the cipher evidence on the table. She spoke not as a killer, but as a witness. "King Aldrin is a usurper. His claim is false. The true heir of Sundergaard stands before you." She placed her hand on Ilara's shoulder. The lords looked at the child, at the documents, at the woman who had been sent to kill one of their own, and had instead brought them the weapon to win. And then, one by one, they knelt. But the captain's final words were true. 3,000 soldiers were already marching, and the rebel forces were a third that number. The war was not over. It was about to begin. And the only chance they had was to hold Thornwall long enough for word of the heir to spread to the common soldiers in Aldrin's army, men who had been told they were fighting rebels, not defending a lie. The battle would come at dawn. As the sun rose, Vessa and Bram stood on the wall, watching the king's banners fill the valley below. She reached for his hand, her green fingers interlacing with his calloused ones, and for the first time in 10 years, he did not feel alone. Neither did she. The truth was about to meet the sword. Dawn broke over Thornwall in bands of iron and rose, and the valley below filled with the sound of 3,000 boots marching in lockstep. King Aldrin himself rode at the center, his silver armor catching the first light, a banner of the rampant stag snapping above his personal guard. He had come to erase the last resistance personally, to watch the rebel lords kneel or die, and to ensure that no whisper of an heir survived the day. He did not know what was waiting for him on the walls. The rebel forces numbered just over 1,000, but they were dug into a fortress that had held for 3 centuries against sieges, and they now had something more powerful than walls: a name. Ilara Sundergaard, the true-born heir, stood with Vessa and Bram on the highest battlement, her dark hair tied back, a leather jerkin too large draped over her shoulders like a queen's mantle. She was 8 years old, and she was about to face the man who had murdered her family. The lords had wanted to hide her in the keep, but Vessa had argued otherwise. "He's coming to kill a lie," she said. "Show him the truth." The king's herald rode forward under a flag of parley, demanding unconditional surrender. The response came not from the rebel commander, but from a child's voice, clear and sharp as a bell, carrying across the field in the stillness before battle. "I am Ilara, daughter of Queen Morel and King Aldric VI, slain by the usurper who calls himself Aldrin. By the stone charter and the blood of the first king, I declare his crown forfeit and his life owed to the realm." The words were not hers alone. She had been coached through the night by the lords who remembered the old forms. But the delivery was all her own, steady and unafraid, the voice of a girl who had spent her life running and was done hiding. For a heartbeat, the king's army stood frozen. The men in the front ranks had been told they were crushing a rebellion of traitors. They had not been told they were marching against the rightful heir. Aldrin spurred his horse forward, his face contorted with fury. "Kill her," he screamed. "Kill the impostor. Burn the fortress." But the hesitation had already spread, the whisper multiplying through the ranks like a crack in ice. Some soldiers lowered their weapons. Others turned to their captains with bewildered questions. The assault that followed was chaotic, half-hearted, and ripe for the counterstrike the rebels had planned. Vessa led the first sortie herself. Her right wrist was still splinted, but she had strapped her blade to her left hand and descended the postern gate with 50 picked fighters. Bram followed, bow in hand, his ankle bound tight, providing covering fire from the flank. They were not trying to win a pitched battle, they were trying to break the king's momentum, to shatter his aura of invincibility. And it worked. Vessa's blade found the first captain who tried to rally the wavering line. Bram's arrows dropped 2 sergeants. Ilara stayed on the wall, visible, a symbol, and every soldier who saw her saw not a pretender, but a child who looked startlingly like the portraits of Queen Morel that still hung in the old temples. The king's army fractured. Whole companies peeled away, commanders refusing orders. The rebel lords, seeing the tide turn, threw open the main gates and charged. Aldrin, abandoned by half his forces, retreated toward the river with his household guard, but the ford was already blocked by Bram's mountain scouts, the same men who had once taught him the trails. Trapped between the pursuing rebels and the impassable rapids, Aldrin made his last stand on a gravel bar as the sun climbed toward noon. Vesa found him there, his silver armor dented, his sword hand trembling. He had been a king who ordered others to kill. Now he faced the assassin he had tried to murder, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "You were nothing," he spat. "A tool, a blade I used and discarded." Vesa looked at him with the predator's eyes that had once made Bram hold his breath. "I was your lie," she said, "and lies always turn on the liars." She disarmed him with a single stroke, the blade spinning into the river, and then she stepped back. She did not kill him. She left him for the rebel lords to take. A trial, not an execution. A reckoning in the light of law, not the dark of an alley. It was, she realized, the first contract she had ever chosen to break. The war ended that afternoon. Aldrin's remaining forces surrendered, and word of Ilara's proclamation spread faster than any army could march. Within a week, the northern garrisons declared for the new queen. Within a month, the capital opened its gates without a fight. The stone charter, which Lyra Corswell had carried in a locket around her neck, a miniature scroll, the original document reduced by ancient alchemy, was presented to the Council of Lords, its hidden clause read aloud. Aldrin's bloodline was declared illegitimate in perpetuity. The throne of Sundergardi passed to Ilara, under a regency council until her majority, and the first decree she signed was to abolish the Shadowed Fang as a state weapon and pardon Vesa for all acts committed under the usurper's orders. The final surprising detail arrived not in the grand halls of the capital, but in a quiet moment weeks later, when Bram and Vesa returned to his cabin in the Thornridge Mountains. The note, the crumpled death warrant that had started everything, still lay on the table where they had left it. Bram picked it up, intending to burn it, and a second piece of parchment slipped from a hidden fold in the wax seal. It was a message from Lyra, written years earlier and placed there intentionally, keyed to the cipher only a Fang operative would know. "If you find this, the Air Lives and Aldrin has betrayed you. Follow the map. Save her. You were never meant to be his weapon. You were meant to be her shield." Vesa read it in silence, then handed it to Bram. The king had not merely double-crossed her, he had unknowingly put the one person capable of saving the heir directly into the path of the one person who could lead her to safety. The betrayal that should have killed her had instead sealed Aldrin's doom. The cabin was not empty when they finally returned. Lyra, who had survived the temple by hiding in a crypt beneath the altar and crawling out after the hunters left, had made her way there, guided by the same mountain folk who had taught Bram the trails. She was thin, haunted, but alive. The three of them stood in the clearing where Bram had once heard failing fingers on stone, and they looked out at a kingdom that was already beginning to heal. A kingdom that now had a queen who knew what it was to be hunted, and who would never forget the forester and the assassin who had brought her home. Bram rebuilt the fence line. Vesa's wrist healed, and she began teaching self-defense to the highland villages, a new purpose that required no killing. On the morning of the first snowfall, Ilara sent a courier with a formal decree. The cabin and the surrounding forest were granted to Bram and Vesa in perpetuity, a gift from a grateful queen who understood that home was the most precious thing a hunted child could ever give someone else. They hung the decree on the wall beside the framed note, the death warrant that had brought them together, and beneath it, they placed the wooden horse that Lyra had carved for Ilara when she was a baby, now given to them as a reminder of the child they had saved. The lonely forester and the orc assassin had started as enemies and ended as the foundation of a new kingdom. And the truth that had been meant to destroy them had instead set an entire realm free. The lonely forester and the orc assassin had started as enemies and ended as the foundation of a new kingdom. And the truth that had been meant to destroy them had instead set an entire realm free. But the question that lingers long after the throne is secure is this: how many other alliances never form because someone refuses to look past the surface, past the green skin, past the assassin's reputation, past the scars of a life lived in hiding? Bram could have let go. He could have walked away from the cliff and told himself it was not his fight. Instead, he reached out, and that single decision rippled outward until it touched a child queen, a hidden heir, and thousands of soldiers who laid down their arms because they saw a little girl who told the truth. The story of Bram and Vesa is not just a fantasy. It is a reminder that the systems of power that crush the vulnerable depend on isolation, on keeping the forester alone in his cabin, the assassin loyal only to her guild, the heir hidden and afraid. The moment they found each other, the king's entire edifice began to crack. Aldrin's greatest mistake was not the double cross. It was forcing two people into proximity who had every reason to hate each other and instead discovered they shared an enemy. That is the variable no tyrant can fully control. What happens when the discarded people of a realm start talking to each other? This channel exists to tell stories exactly like this one. Stories where the overlooked, the underestimated, and the betrayed rise up and reshape the world. If that is the kind of tale you want more of, the kind that proves that loyalty can bloom in the most barren ground, and that the truth, once spoken, cannot be silenced, then you are in the right place. Hit subscribe, tell us where you are watching from, and drop a comment below. What was the moment in this story that hit you hardest? Was it the cliff, the note, the child's wave, or the final stand at Thornwall? We read every comment, and your voice helps shape the next chronicle we tell. The cabin still stands in the Thornridge Mountains. The fence line is straight now, the roof patched with strong timber. Inside, above the hearth, a framed death warrant hangs beside a royal decree of gratitude. And in the evenings, when the mist clings to the cliffs like a held breath, a forester and a former assassin sit on the porch and watch the stars come out over a kingdom that is still learning to be free. The note that was supposed to kill them both remains exactly where they put it, not hidden, not burned, but displayed. A reminder that the worst betrayal can become the foundation of something unstoppable, and that sometimes the hand you pull from the abyss is the one that saves you in return.